Hello and welcome to another episode of the Gritty Hour. We're back this week with a very special guest. I have Caroline Ailanthus who is a science writer, correct, Caroline? By trade. And she's written a book called Ecological Memory, which is a very interesting novel about I don't want to say post-apocalyptical, maybe post-pandemic. The irony is she wrote it pre-COVID, which is very interesting. So welcome to the Gritty Hour, Caroline. It's an honor to have you on board. And I think
be here.
Oh, very good. So you're a science writer by trade, which prompts the question. Go ahead.
A little elaboration on that. Almost all the writing I do has something to do with science.
Okay.
It's not always. I do very little scholarly work. I haven't done that in a while, but I would if I could. I hope to in the future. And almost everything has science is the theme that organizes all of my writing.
Is there a niche in science within that realm that you focus on, or is it general science?
You mean as far as scientific discipline?
Well, yeah, any kind of specific nuance within the science field that you focus on?
Life sciences. I have a degree in conservation biology.
Okay.
All and right. So anything related to that is really my forte. I'm not really that much into the technology side of things. And
understood. All right. So a lot of it is focused on ecological science. Okay, very good. Which kind of answers my next question, maybe how you got into writing Ecological Memory, which is a very interesting novel.
The short answer is I went to grad school and then I started daydreaming and poured everything I learned in grad school into a novel.
Interesting. Very interesting. But I like your take, and I said before we started recording, it's a little prescient because the book is focused on trying. I guess, correct me if I'm wrong. Trying to relearn things post catastrophe.
More like reinvention.
Okay.
Or rebuilding, because you're not. The word ecological memory is a technical term. I use it because it's one of those few technical terms that means something to non-technical people too. And so it kind of has a double meaning, but it's a technical term. So let's say that there's a forest fire or something, and then a forest grows back.
Right.
If the forest that grows back is the same kind of forest that used to be there before, that's because of ecological memory. The land remembers the earlier ecosystem.
Wow.
So the idea is when a forest fire happens in a human life or a human community, to what extent can you regrow? To what extent can you put yourself back together? And sometimes you can, sometimes you can't.
Almost like a DNA type thing, right?
Almost, yeah.
Well, let me ask you this way. The book it's not really a document. It's not really like a factual document. It's more of a novel, correct?
Oh, it's entirely a novel.
Yeah, it takes.
It's a well-researched, science-based novel, but it is a novel.
Okay, and it's based around two characters that survive a pandemic, as far as I could see.
Yep.
Yeah, sorry about that, Caroline. I'm not technologically advanced enough to make this a smooth operation. But what I was asking you was, so there's two main characters in the book, Etzy and Andy, and they are survivors of the pandemic. Tell us a little bit about them, how they fit in the book, how they became survivors, how they got to be survivors. If you don't mind, elaborate.
Well, they got to be survivors same way all survivors do. You don't die yet. as a kid.
Well, that makes sense. Yeah.
Uh, yeah, about this, I want to say something about this pandemic briefly, though, um, if I may. It's a weird coincidence that I wrote a book about the aftermath of a pandemic right before we had a pandemic. I mean, literally, it was just months before.
Mm-hmm.
But it wasn't me that was prescient.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the people who study this sort of thing knew this was going to happen. They
Mm-hmm.
they didn't know when or where or the details, but something like this was going to happen. Um, there is a great book that I recommend in the back of mine actually, um, called Spillover by David Quammen.
Mm-hmm.
And everybody who knows about this sort of thing knew this was going to happen. And the pandemic in the book is a lot worse than ours. It's an extreme worst case scenario, and it crashes civilization globally.
Mm-hmm.
So the book is set 20 years after the sudden and catastrophic end of civilization, when something else is developing. There's a new society growing up. It's just different than the
Mm-hmm.
one before in a lot of ways.
Mm-hmm.
So Andy is an ecologist. When the pandemic happened and the crash, he was, you know, early in his career, in his 30s, that sort of thing, had a young family. Um, and either the pandemic or its aftermath basically killed almost everybody he knew.
Mm-hmm.
And it was this wrenching trauma for him.
Mm-hmm.
And he survived because he got lucky. He had friends who took him in, looked after him.
Mm-hmm.
And in the 20 years since, he was able to put some kind of life back together, start a new career again as an ecologist,
Mm-hmm.
um, find a way to be in the new society. And Elsie is his student. She is, so he's now in his late 50s. She's in her 20s.
Mm-hmm.
And she is studying to be an environmental educator. This is a very high demand job in this world because everybody is very aware of the ecological disasters and problems that happened before the pandemic. They don't want to do that again.
Mm-hmm.
So conservation scientists, science communicators, those it's a very in-demand field. So she's studying to be with this under him. And they're traveling. They're traveling through New England, and they're traveling on foot because there's no petroleum anymore. So when you want to get somewhere, basically you walk.
Mm-hmm.
It's not a low tech world. It's a low energy world. There's a big difference, so they have computers.
Mm-hmm.
They're expensive, but they have computers.
Mm-hmm.
They have, ambulances,
Mm-hmm.
but you can't hop in a car and drive somewhere. You
Mm-hmm.
walk, you take a horse, you ride a bike. So they're walking through New England, stopping at various towns and doing these little workshops and things. And she starts having these kind of post-traumatic memories of a forest she lived in when she was a child during the transition.
Mm.
So some of the memories are clearly from before the pandemic, some are from after.
Right.
So this was her childhood home. This was where she survived. She doesn't know where it was. She doesn't remember. She doesn't know how she survived or what happened.
Mm.
Um, but she has these memories of this forest, particular trees that grew there. And as the story goes on, she keeps having more of these. So the list of trees that she keeps growing.
Mm-hmm.
And he's an ecologist. So he volunteers, like, okay, let's figure out where this forest grew, because you couldn't just be anywhere.
Mm-hmm.
So this becomes a detective story.
I see.
But it's also, how the relationship is developing. I'm going to say right now, it's not a romance. Men and women have other ways they can interact. But it's the development of their relationship, the development of their friendship, even though neither of them are really easy to be friends with.
Mm-hmm.
And dealing not only with her hurt and pain and feeling lost and all of that, but also his.
Mm-hmm.
There's a lot of stuff that he's kept buried for a long time. And here he is with this student who's um, the same age his daughter would be if she were still alive.
Mm-hmm.
And this is this
So
very powerful
he lost
thing
his
for
daughter to
her.
the pandemic then too. He lost his
He
whole
lost
family.
his daughter
Mm-hmm.
and his wife,
Mm-hmm.
and his son vanished.
Oh, interesting.
So yeah, that, and I've sometimes that's worse.
Mm-hmm.
People who have lost a loved one to death, you can get over that eventually. I mean, you don't get over it, but you there's closure
Mm-hmm.
eventually. People whose loved ones just go missing,
Mm-hmm.
and there's no explanation, and
Mm-hmm.
there's nothing you can do.
Right.
That's the wound he's bearing. And so
Well, the two of them go on this journey together, and I guess anybody listening would think, well, the name of the book is Ecological Memory, but the devastation occurred from a virus pandemic. Was there any damage done to the ecology, or like you just mentioned the trees? Were the trees no longer there, or that's what I'm curious. I don't want to give too much of the book away, but anybody pedestrianly listening to us is probably going to ask the same question in their head.
no, the virus didn't damage the trees. Um, as far as the trees go, the virus was actually a pretty good thing. Um, and there, yeah, and that happened. I mean, there are real examples right now of awful disasters that end up being, um, in some ways, really good things environmentally, like Chernobyl, the nuclear disaster.
Mm-hmm.
The exclusion area of Chernobyl, where humans can never live again, because if you go there, if you spend too much time there, your risk of cancer is just way too high.
Right.
It's become this amazing wildlife refuge,
Mm-hmm.
because wild animals mostly don't live long enough to get cancer anyway.
Mm.
And there aren't any humans there. So it's a paradise for them.
Yeah, there actually are people that live there, which I find amazing.
Yeah.
But these old babushkas that are still there, and they seem to be thriving. I don't know, maybe the same reason why the deer and the antelope play there now. So we'll see.
Yeah.
Yeah.
But see, okay, one thing to understand about the word ecology.
Mm-hmm.
I think most people may hear that term and associate it with, well, it just means nature.
Mm-hmm.
So okay, so maybe this book is out about a problem with nature. And
Right.
it's really not. It's about a solution with nature that we don't like and we have to try and come to terms with.
Mm-hmm.
But an ecosystem is a system,
Mm-hmm.
lots of different parts interacting in complex and intricate ways.
Right. Right.
That's what makes an ecosystem.
Mm-hmm.
Um, and there are literal ecosystems, which, where the interacting parts are species in their environments. But a lot of the same rules apply to other kinds of systems,
Mm-hmm.
like human societies and even the insides of our own heads. These are all complex systems that work by a lot of the same rules.
Mm-hmm.
So the kinds of dynamics that happen when there is a forest fire or logging or something are in some ways not all that different from what happens when there's some catastrophe in a human society. Either way, it's a system putting itself back together,
Mm-hmm.
successfully or less so. You're never going to go back to the way it was before.
Right.
Uh,
To your point, whenever you hear about a forest fire somewhere in California or somewhere in the world, there's always somebody that says, well, forest fires are necessary to breed more forests. So I don't know if that's the point you were trying to make or not, but.
uh, Not especially.
Mm-hmm.
Now there are some forests that need to burn periodically.
Mm-hmm.
They tend to need particular kinds of fire.
Mm-hmm.
So a lot of what's happening out west is fires that are for various reasons, and I could have lots of fun explaining what they are, but that might not interest everybody. But for various reasons, um, a lot of the fires that are happening right now are way too hot, and they are not the kind of fires that those forests need.
Mm-hmm. I see.
Um,
So yeah, like a control burn, more like a control burn is what's needed.
well, at this point, yeah. I
Mm-hmm.
mean, I used to do fuels reduction cutting in Arizona,
Mm-hmm.
actually,
Mm-hmm.
and so the fires had been suppressed
Mm-hmm.
for 80 years. So there hadn't been enough fire to clear out a lot of the younger trees, and the forest got way too dense. So when a fire did can't come, it was just so hot it sterilized the soil, and then nothing could grow there for decades.
Right.
So
Right.
what we were doing is we were going through and we were thinning out the forest
Mm-hmm.
so that grass could grow in between the trees. And then so that when a fire, either prescribed or natural,
Mm-hmm.
would come through, it would burn a lot cooler. And that's the kind that they need. And in fact, there was a fire that approached Flagstaff through an area that we had treated a couple of years later, and it worked.
Mm-hmm.
It didn't go into the city and it didn't burn too hot.
Right. Yeah. Well, that's a
Oh,
good point. Yeah. And and that brings more nutrients into the soil where the trees grow back from, which is the
yeah.
point the point that they're always making whenever there's a forest fire. I didn't realize about the heat, being a major factor in that. But I do understand the concept as you explain it. So, but anyway, back to the book. So there's nothing catastrophic going on in the only catastrophe was the pandemic in this book.
Well, we're in the middle of a catastrophe, and I don't mean COVID.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, we're in the middle of the sixth mass extinction that our planet has had.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, Things are dire.
Mm-hmm.
So in my book, the pandemic happens
Mm-hmm.
and stops a lot of that, and really presses the reset button. The pandemic doesn't hurt the environment, really only humans.
Right.
But the earth is having to recover from what humans did to it.
I see.
So it's recovering too. It's just not recovering from the pandemic. It's recovering from what we did to it before the pandemic.
Right. Without giving too much away from the book, how much of the population was decreased, or how much of a decrease happened in the population, I should say.
Oh, you find that out on the first or second page.
Okay.
10% survival rate.
Ah, okay.
Now, as is explained later,
Plenty of parking.
plenty of parking, yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Um, the pandemic itself um, in my story um, has an 80% survival rate, which is still absurdly low. I mean, COVID at its worst killed like maybe 3% of the people it infected, and it
Mm-hmm.
didn't infect everybody.
Right.
I mean, if you can imagine, picture yourself in a room of 10 people
Mm-hmm.
and two of them are gone.
Mm-hmm.
Any room.
Right.
That's the kind of disease the book is talking about. But then when civilization collapsed, uh, the collapse killed huge numbers of people because the food trucks stopped coming.
I see.
And the chance of a pandemic shutting down civilization is actually really low.
Mm-hmm.
That's not likely at all.
Mm-hmm.
The chance of something going wrong and triggering a collapse is actually really scary. We
Mm-hmm.
are very vulnerable because of the way our economic system is constructed with these very long supply chains and stretching all the way across the country. And if something goes wrong over here, then something else breaks over there, and pretty soon there's no food on the shelves.
Mm-hmm.
That's no, I don't. It's not something to be alarmist about. I don't want to make too much of it. I don't want to exaggerate. It's not like, buy canned beans, everybody.
Mm-hmm.
Just pay attention. We
Right.
really do need to pay attention to what kind of systems we're building,
Right.
because we are vulnerable. That
I
part's very real.
I'd be interested because I guess most of our listeners, this is the first time they're hearing about this book, and if they go out and buy it and read it, I'd be interested, which you would know better than me, like the people who read the book when it first came out, pre-pandemic for the most
Mhm.
part, what their reaction was versus the people who have lived through the last 3 years that have the experience of dealing with shutdowns and all the things that were related to the pandemic. If they have a different they have a different take on the book, that would be an interesting analytical comparison.
It would be, and I can't really do that analysis because most people who read the book never talk to me about it.
Well, it's true, yeah, but yeah.
uh, there have been a few people who read it beforehand and then emailed me when the real pandemic started,
Hmm.
and said, like, hey, can we please not have your book come true?
Yeah,
They
right,
were
right,
freaked
right.
out.
Especially
Uh,
the supply chain element, yeah, which
yeah, that freaked me out a bit.
because we do have some sort of stuttering in that regard as well. Right now, that's as we're recording, we're having that situation. Maybe not to a
Yeah,
major extent, but we're having a situation related to that right now.
right. To even have it at all
Hmm.
is really scary,
Yeah,
especially since in the grand scheme of things, not real. I mean, the stress to the system has not been that big.
yeah. Well, Americans specifically are not used to that. Our society anyway. I want to bring our listeners' attention to your website, if that's possible, which
Yeah,
is you'll find it in the show notes, whoever's watching us or listening to us. Newsfromcaroline.wordpress.com. And if it's all right with you, Caroline, I'd like to put that up on the page
yeah, that's fine.
just to show people your WordPress site, which I think is very interesting. Well, that's your Amazon page. Sorry. I
Well,
want
you can
to.
look at that too.
Well, I did. I wanted to. Well, actually, while we're here, so this book came out in 2019, which is makes it even more eerie. So I understand the
Yeah,
feedback you're getting from the people that wrote it prior to the pandemic. But you do have interesting reviews on them, and I would love to know what the difference of reaction would be post and pre-pandemic from our point of view. Um,
I'll tell you, the way we do this is everybody who listens to or watches this podcast, go out, read my book, leave me reviews, and then we'll
yeah,
know.
and then we'll know. Then we'll do an analysis. We'll do
Yeah.
a pre and post pandemic analysis. Can you see your WordPress site on your screen? I want to make sure the
Yes, I
people can
can.
see it. Okay. So this is the WordPress site, newsfromcaroline.wordpress.com. And you mentioned the book in here, but there's a lot of lovely little tidbits about like this last one about Halloween. I think I told you before we started recording, I'm of an Irish origin for the most part, and I was interested in the Celtic origins of Halloween, which you go into in this first post here. So
Yeah.
what can people expect from your WordPress site?
Well, uh, most weeks I talk about whatever's on my mind. I have various projects, and a lot of my posts are articles about on the craft of writing. Like I'll read something and I'll either like it or I won't, and I'll write about why.
Mm-hmm.
Or I'll be working on some story and there'll be this great piece of world building I do, and it's never going to see print. It's just background.
Mm-hmm.
So I'll stick it in my blog. But when I do have a new book coming out, this is where I'm going to tell people first.
I see. Okay.
So you want to know, that's why it's news from Caroline. You want to know
Right.
what the news is, that's a good place to go.
Right.
I'm on
Okay.
Facebook too, by the way.
On Facebook as well. Okay. So
Oh,
this is
and
yeah.
I'm the only human, I'm the only living human with my last name, as far as I can tell.
Is that right?
Which, that's right. And that makes me really easy to find on an internet search.
Yes. Yes. Well, it's Ailanthus.
Yeah.
Yeah. Very cool. And I asked you before we started recording how to pronounce it, but I guess you weren't overly concerned. But I guess if you're the only one, it doesn't really matter as long as it's spelled right. Yeah.
Well, it matters to me. I
Yeah.
go,
Well,
it
I know. Yeah.
the number of people who call me Atlantis, like the sunken continent, like
Yes.
that's not even how it's spelled.
I said it right. I think Ailanthus. Am I right?
Yeah. Yeah,
Okay.
that's
And
right.
that's with my Bronx accent, which is very difficult. THs are not my strong point. But
Well,
yes,
both my
that's
parents are from New York, so I can respect
okay. You
that.
can relate to me. Okay, good. So, but this is kind of like I was reading this afternoon. This is kind of like musings, right? Little stories, little snippets, little bits of information.
Mhm,
But you do, in fact, have the category about the ecological memory book.
mhm.
Um, so, is that how you break it down? The site? It's a pretty extensive site, actually.
Yeah, well, I post to it usually I post to the blog part of it every week.
Hmm.
Um, and then if you scroll up so they can see the menu bar, yeah, um, you can kind of see there among ecological memory is one of the options, and there you can see the blurb from the back of the book and the cover and
So, if I
links
go
to
there
where you
now.
can buy a copy.
Hmm.
My earlier book, that's up there too.
Hmm.
Um, the next book will eventually have it. So um, yeah, there are blog posts that are either about ecological memory or touch on it in some way.
Hmm.
Um, there are posts that don't, and it has its own page as
Okay.
well.
Okay. So, and I know again, I went on Amazon before. Now I can't find it. I have this problem every. There it is. Okay. So this would be the best place for people to purchase the book.
Depends how you define best.
Well,
Um,
I've said this in previous podcasts. I learned from a previous author that I interviewed on this podcast that if you go into your local bookstore and you ask for a specific book, they will order it
mhm,
just about 100% of the time, even if it's
mhm.
not stocked there at the moment.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Um, I would sort of ideal would be if you order it through your local bookstore or from my publisher, Saltwater Media.
Okay.
Uh, that's I don't get a great deal from Amazon,
Hmm. I understand.
and I also want people to support their local bookstores. I want people to support my publisher. They're good people.
Hmm.
However, if you don't know where your local bookstore is, you can't remember the name of my publisher, so on and so forth, and you go to Amazon and buy my book, that's great too. I'm not going to complain. So
Yeah, well,
whatever
that's
the
right.
best way
Ever
to,
since that fella told me that, I've been saying it almost every time I did a podcast with an author. I kind of throw that in there because it does support the local. A
yeah,
lot of bookstores nowadays are all independent, and it helps. It better helps the author. So
yeah.
yeah, so that would be a good way to do it. But like she said, if you have to go through Amazon, by God, you can do that too. And there's
And
also
Amazon,
there's a Kindle version on. There's a lot of
yeah,
people
there's
read
a
it on
Kindle
Kindle.
version, there's a Nook version,
Hmm.
so you can do that either way. And Amazon does have the look inside feature.
Yeah.
So if you're going to order something online, even if you order it through my publisher,
Hmm.
you can use Amazon's look inside feature to,
Right.
browse around.
I understand. That's saltwatermedia.com.
Yeah.
All right. If that's all right with you, I'll throw that a link on the show notes as well for anyone listening or watching on YouTube. So this came out in 2019. Has the reception been in general?
Uh, Good.
Hmm.
Well, okay. Star Trek fans are familiar with Dr. McCoy saying, like, I'm a doctor, not a whatever. Well, in a similar spirit, I'm a writer, not a marketer.
Mm, mm-hmm, mm-hmm.
So not a whole lot of people know about my book yet. I have to
Okay.
admit this.
Yeah.
However, the ones who know it, who know about it, like it.
Mm-hmm.
All of the feedback that I've gotten from people who have actually found out that it exists,
Mm-hmm.
it's really positive.
Right. Well, right as I'm looking at my computer, right below our two little boxes where our faces are, is a thing on Amazon that says only 7 left in stock, more on the way. It might not say that when you actually watch this on YouTube. It'll be at when this airs on YouTube. So I would go there as soon as you can. But if it happens to be sold out on Amazon, take take uh, A Avenue, which is go to your local bookstore and ask for this specific book, and they will order it for you almost 100% of the
Mhm.
time, as far as I can tell from independent bookstores I've dealt with. So
Yeah.
that would be a great place to go. So
Oh,
you had mentioned. Go ahead. I'm sorry to interrupt you. Go ahead.
as long as we're talking about great ways to buy books that help authors,
Hmm.
any way that you buy a book is a good way to buy a book.
Uh huh.
It's very important to not return books. I mean,
Hmm.
it's less important with Kindle and so forth, but you have a paper book in your hand, and this is not just for me, this is for any author. Don't return those. If you get
Hmm.
one and you accidentally order two or something like that, if you get one that you don't want, give it away,
Hmm.
sell it on eBay, whatever you need to do.
Hmm.
Don't return books, because what happens is, and I'm not the only one that this happens to, what happens is when you buy a book, I get paid the difference between the purchase price and the printing price and other fees, right?
Hmm.
When you return a book, I get charged the printing price,
Hmm.
which is bigger than so I have to sell 3 books in order to make enough money to cover a return.
Right.
Don't return books, not mine, not anybody else's. Give them away, sell them, do whatever you need to do. Don't return books.
That's a great point. I'm glad you said that because I don't think, myself included, I don't think people were aware of that.
It's not,
That's
I didn't know it either until I
yeah.
started getting bills.
Well, sure.
Not that I've
Yeah.
gotten a lot of returns,
Yeah.
but there's been a few.
Can you tell us a little bit about the previous book to Ecological Memory?
Yeah, To Give a Rose.
Okay.
Uh, that was the first book that I wrote, and it's a little hard to talk about because there's lots of things I didn't know when I wrote it.
Hmm.
And one of the things that I didn't know was that it really helps if, when you're writing a book, you figure out what the elevator speech is when you're writing it, so you don't accidentally write a book that has no elevator speech. I mean, an elevator speech, for those who don't know, is how you explain something to somebody you bump into in an elevator.
Ah,
So you
I
have like 15 seconds or
I'm glad
whatever.
you said that because I was going to ask what that was. So go ahead.
Yeah, that's what an elevator speech is. So my first book, I accidentally wrote it in a way that makes it really hard to describe. Um, but I can give you some idea
Mm-hmm.
by saying that most of it is set 2.5 million years ago, and most of the main characters are not human.
Mm-hmm.
They are these proto-human ape creatures. You can see
Nice.
one hand on the thing. And so it's things happening in their community across 70 years,
Mm-hmm.
interspersed, like every couple of chapters, there's one section set in our world among humans, and the two stories kind of comment on each other thematically.
Mm-hmm.
And that one is there's a whole shelf on a universe in the university library near where I live that I basically read everything on that shelf. I mean, the species most of the characters are, it's called Australopithecus afarensis. I know that's way too many syllables. It's basically Latin for southern ape from the Afar Valley. It's,
Mm.
it's Latin for that.
Mm-hmm.
I call them foot apes. That's easier to pronounce. Anyway, as far as I know, mine is the deepest, broadest, and most serious um, reconstruction of a plausible behavior plan, sorry, plausible behavior pattern and world for
Mm-hmm.
this particular species.
Mm-hmm.
In all the research I encountered, and I mean, it's going back several years ago now, maybe somebody else has done one better than me, but at the time I was writing the book, there wasn't anything comparable in terms of making this world come alive again.
Mm.
So if you want to go play in the Pliocene for a couple of days, this is the book for you.
I suspect your writing style is analogical. Like you come up with a scenario that drives home a point from like ecological memory using the pandemic and the subsequent collapse of society to maybe bring home a point about mankind's effect on the ecology.
Oh, you mean like I'm trying to deliver a message?
Well, using a different kind of like an analogy, so to speak.
Yes and no. I
Hmm.
mean, for me, the ideal book, both as a reader and as a writer,
Hmm.
is one that exists on multiple levels. So there's a level of like, oh, these, characters doing stuff. Isn't this entertaining? And then there's a level where it's trying to teach you something or show you something or.
Right.
And so I definitely try and go there, but that's not the starting point of my writing.
Okay.
And I've tried starting there sometimes and it doesn't work. The projects go off on their own direction and do what they
Hmm.
do, and whatever point I was trying to make is left way behind. Uh, what I do is some kind of question will start interesting me.
Hmm.
In the case of To Give a Rose, the original question was, um, if we can somehow get one of these extinct proto-human species and our own species in the same frame, so to speak,
Hmm.
um, what would that be like? Uh, and so that's where that started. With ecological memory, where it started was, okay, some days, on bad days, I think like a lot of other people sometimes have these daydreams like civilization is bothering me. There's just all kinds of awful stuff happening. It should all go away and
Hmm.
just
Hmm.
start over.
Hmm.
Wouldn't that be great? And one day I thought, well, let's imagine if that happens, and it happens in the best possible way that's believable. Something awful collapses everything, and what happens afterwards is just as good as it can be.
Mm-hmm.
What's it like to live through the transition?
Mm-hmm.
What would that actually be like
Right.
to live through, instead of treating um I don't want to even daydream about people as collateral damage.
Mm-hmm.
Let's
Mm-hmm.
take this seriously. If this daydream came true, what would it be like? What's the
Mm-hmm.
real human cost of this? How would people get through it?
Mm-hmm.
So that's where that started.
Right.
And both of them went in their own directions. Ecological memory does have a message,
Mm-hmm.
um, although it's a message that only appeared to me when I was most of the way through writing the book, actually.
Mm-hmm.
To give a rose sort of has a message, although it's not as well focused. But I didn't start out with either message.
I
And
understand.
if you read either book and don't get the message, that's okay. As long as you like reading it, that's fine.
Right. Well, that's the thing.
There's
I
no
think,
wrong way to read a book.
well, true. And I think anybody who, especially on the ecological memory book, anybody who reads it, whatever your point of view is on, let's say the words global warming as an example, you're following two characters and you become interested in how they relate to one another and how they survive the current conditions they're living in. So,
Mhm,
like you said before, on that level, it's entertaining to just follow their story
mhm.
for the length of time you take them through.
Yeah,
Yeah. So I understand what you're saying. Um, so, but you did hint to something else in the works coming down the pike.
yeah. Ecological memory is getting a sequel.
Ah, okay.
It doesn't have a title yet. It has working titles, but they keep changing.
Well, if you don't call it the Gritty Hour, you can use any title you want.
I
Yeah.
don't think there's any worry about that.
But
Um,
it is along those lines, similar thematically to ecological memory.
it's the same world,
Is it
just a couple of years later.
the same two characters, the same two
They're both
protagonists?
in it.
Okay.
There are other characters as well, but
Okay.
both Andy and Elsie do return.
Mm-hmm.
And there is there's a lot more going on in it. It's actually a um, collection of shorter pieces, couple of novellas, couple of short stories
Mm-hmm.
that are that each have their own separate plot, but they have a lot of the same characters and they're all in the same world. And if you read them in order, they do make a whole, and there's a larger arc that they all do. So it's been a fun challenge putting it together.
Mm-hmm.
But it follows, some of the if to the extent to which it has a message, the message is different.
Mm-hmm. Well, one point you just said earlier was struck me. Sometimes the place you're at when you're done writing the book is not the place you started from. The book
Pretty much
itself takes
always.
you. The book itself takes you to the different place or the
Yeah,
different. Yeah, that's very interesting. I've never heard a writer say that, but
really.
I always suspected that they did. Yeah,
I would be surprised if there are many who don't.
it
I
probably
mean,
it's yes, probably it's probably 100%, right? Yeah,
probably.
yeah.
Yeah.
How do you just do you take like LZ and Andy and you let them dictate where they go and you kind of
Um,
blow it out in words?
yeah, I mean, Andy himself is he likes throwing curveballs.
At you, the writer?
Yes.
Okay. All right.
um, yeah, I'm a very visual writer.
Uh-huh.
uh, a lot of these scenes start out as movies in my head,
Mm-hmm.
and then I write down what I see and I
Mm-hmm.
write down what I hear them talking about. It
Right.
doesn't really feel most of the time like I'm inventing it. I'm just sort of, okay, here are the parameters. Here's your starting point. Now go.
Right. Right.
And
That's interesting how the character takes you along for the ride.
yeah,
Yeah. That's fairly
yeah, and it's things can come out of this process that I didn't know I knew. And
mm-hmm.
I don't think I knew before the process happened.
Mm.
Um, I mean, my characters had been through things that I haven't, and particularly hadn't before I started writing the book.
Mm-hmm.
When I started writing this book, which is about all of this catastrophic loss and pain and difficulty and survival and putting yourself back together. Um, None of that had ever really happened to me. Not like everything's been hunky dory all the time, every minute of every day. But, you know, I hadn't really lost anybody who's, let alone multiple people.
Right.
Um, Between the publication of this book and the launch party, my sister died.
Ah. Okay.
And then there have been so many funerals in the last couple of years.
Yeah.
And it turns out that the way Andy handles it, the way Andy handles his losses
Mm-hmm.
helps.
It's cathartic in a sense. I'm sorry for the loss of your sister. Did she get to read the final product?
I don't know. I mean,
No.
no, she
No.
didn't.
Okay. But she knew you
I,
would. She would knew you were doing it. You were
yeah,
doing the book. Okay. Well,
yeah.
that's good. Yeah. Well, I'm sorry for your loss. Um. So anybody who goes to, I appreciate you coming here tonight. It was very interesting. I always like trying to get into the mind of an author because I'm always fascinated about how they go from the first page to the last page and everything in between. And I appreciate what you said that the character takes you along rather than vice versa. Um, so I would recommend anybody listening to us or watching us to go to newsfromcaroline.wordpress.com. Reason why you get to see a little bit of her writing style. Because how often do you post onto you have a lot of muses on there, little short stories and stuff, snippets. Do you post with fairly regular?
The blog portion gets a new post almost every week, usually on
Right.
Mondays.
Right. So you can get a good glimpse into Caroline's writing style and also the full synopsis of Ecological Memory book, and also To Give a Rose. And as the name of the site would suggest, News from Caroline, you will get firsthand knowledge of when the next book comes out. What's your ETA on that, or do you have one? Are you in the process of writing still?
I finished the first draft. I
Uh-huh.
have begun revisions.
Okay.
I'm hoping it'll be sometime in the next year.
Okay, cool. So, and we'll all be able to find it here first on
Yeah.
newsfromcaroline.wordpress.com. All right. Well, thank you so much for your time tonight, Caroline. It was really very interesting. And I'm actually going to buy if I could pronounce it properly, I'm going to buy Ecological Memory, but don't tell anybody, but I might buy it from Amazon. Sorry.
As long as you buy it.
Okay. And I do appreciate your time tonight and the best of luck. And when the next book comes out, shoot me an email and we'll get you back on the show to talk about that one.
I will. That'd be great.
Okay. Thank you so much, Caroline. Have a great evening.
You too. Thank
Thank
you.
you.